so that'll be fine. No worries. Good. All right,
I can share it again, actually.
Have you interviewed anywhere yet, or are you interviewing?
I have not. I've just started looking at job ads and hopefully applying soon.
That looks good. There it is. Screen looks good. So your plan then is to interview next year, the fall and the spring. So you're going to be doing a postdoc, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm looking at some postdocs and some faculty jobs, and hopefully I'll be graduating in December.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good. Excellent. Well, I wish you the best of luck, and I think you'll be very successful because you're extremely focused and serious, and you have all the right attributes to become successful. So I'm fully behind you, and I think that you're going to make a big mark. So it's
Thank
nice,
you.
when I look back, I'm going to be retiring after 36 years of teaching, and 31 years here at the University of Florida. But you look back and you say, okay, what have you done with your career? There's a couple of key papers that I put out that still get referenced a whole lot, and they made a big difference. And one of the biggest thrills I ever had once, I ran into a guy at a conference, and he said, they were using one of your models that you came up with to do traffic flow estimation. It was in Denmark. And I was like, what? He goes, yeah. He goes, that's one of the models you created. And I was like, I don't know. Even if little things like that happen to you, it's like, I made an impact. It's weird because sometimes you don't think you make an impact in the academic world, but you know what? We do. We touch people's lives, but there's those moments are really like golden. So yes. I wish you many of those. Is what I'm saying.
A good measure of impact.
Yeah, it's fun. It's nice to hear stuff like that. It's just, like another time I was at a conference. This is back in 2000, early 2000s. I think I was at a regional science conference, and a guy said to me, he goes, we used your textbook in my economic geography course. And I'm like, really? My textbook? And he goes, yeah. He goes, the kids loved it. I'm like, okay, cool. That was another, it's another little moment that you go, wow, this is pretty, it does make a difference, and that's, I don't know, that's all we could wish for, I guess. So, okay, well, what's going to happen at 2:59 is we'll get ready in about 6 minutes, and I'll do a short introduction. It'll be 30, 40 seconds. I'm just going to, you have let me see, you have an MDP. What is MDP technically?
It's a Master's of Sustainable Development.
Okay. Okay.
Not a very common one.
That's what I'm saying. And where did you get that from? University of Florida?
Yeah, it's it's linked with Center for African Studies and Center for Latin American Studies.
Okay, because I was unfamiliar with that. And I'm going, what is it? Okay, Master's in Sustainable Development. Got it. Cool.
It's a pretty small program.
My stepdaughter, who is at the Santa Fe Community College, and she wants to move into architecture. One of the things she wants to do is sustainable architecture, which is pretty interesting stuff. So it's like a hybrid of sustainable development, environmental science, architecture stuff. And then kind of a neat little twist. I never heard of it before, but it's like that's the field she wants to get into, sustainable architecture.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens with that. I wish her, she had problems focusing for a while. She went to FSU for a semester and just hated it. And then she didn't know what she wanted to do. And finally, she found something, it was an environmental science class or something that stimulated her to move her in that direction. It's how odd that is. Like, all of a sudden she comes from, doing a class in environmental science, and she says, I want to do architecture. And then I said, how does that relate? She goes, sustainable architecture. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Oh no, I don't know any of this stuff. There's so many subfields now today. It's amazing. Okay, so you got a master's in sustainable development. Yes, wildlife ecology. Okay. Sorry about the poster. I had nothing to put in terms of a graphic, so I put a little map of South Africa.
That's okay. It works quite well.
Yeah, it was neat. It was a neat little map. I like maps on posters. I like to do the artwork to have it where people are attracted to the artwork, the poster, so they'll at least read it and then maybe come to the talk, which would be good. Anyway, I think I left a copy of the poster in your mailbox, so.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, cool. You can hang it up on a wall.
Yes, I will keep it. One of my mementos.
There you go. University of Florida. Okay, what else? I guess that's it. Oh, and try to keep it, don't run over time over the class period, so ask for questions. You know the routine.
Yeah, mine's about 30 minutes.
Okay, well.
So we'll have time for questions and answers.
That's good. That's on the short side. I have people who have had 60-minute presentations this semester, so it'll be a welcome change. West Tyranny, Jane just piped in here. Okay, how you doing? Hello there, everybody. All right, good. All right, good. Hope we have good attendance today. Okay. We'll start in about 2 minutes. One more minute, we'll begin. I'll do the introduction. Okay, hello everybody. It's 3 o'clock. This is the Department of Geography Colloquium series. This will be the last talk of the semester for 2021 spring. And we have one of our own, a speaker today. Leandra Mers is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Ecology and Conservation and a master's degree in Sustainable Development from the University of Florida. Her areas of expertise are wildlife conservation, human-wildlife conflict, and community-based natural resource management. And we're happy to have her with us today. And take her away, Leandra.
Thank you, Dr. Fick. I'm Leandra Mers, and I want to start by thanking everyone who's joining us in real time today, as well as anyone watching later. Today, I will be presenting on a coupled human and wildlife systems in Southern Africa. For a little bit of background, wildlife populations are declining globally, and a recent estimate suggests that they have declined on average by 68% from 1970 to 2016. The primary threats to wildlife are all anthropogenic. They range from overexploitation to invasive species and habitat loss or degradation, as well as other threats. While we have many protected areas to help conserve wildlife, these protected areas tend to be too small to support healthy populations, particularly of large mammals. And it's outside of these protected areas that humans and wildlife rely on shared resources, which can often lead to competition or even conflict. The term human-wildlife conflict refers to any interactions between human and wildlife that have a negative impact on one or both groups. It can include livestock predation, crop raiding, human injury or death, disease transmission, poaching or killing of wildlife, and habitat conversion or degradation. And mitigating human-wildlife conflict and promoting coexistence is vital for the well-being of both humans and wildlife, especially in shared spaces near existing protected areas. So I'm going to give a very quick introduction to coupled human and natural systems. I use this approach because humans are inextricably linked to their environment. We cannot examine humans or natural systems separately. So the coupled human and natural systems approach allows us to examine social and ecological components of a system simultaneously, while also addressing multiple spatial and temporal scales. This approach can be applied to a variety of different natural systems or coupled human and natural systems, but it is incredibly valuable for exploring human and wildlife interactions. And that's what I will focus on today. I've applied a coupled human and wildlife systems framework to the study of human-wildlife interactions in Southern Africa with the joint goals of conserving wildlife and improving human well-being. Some of the topics that I work on are wildlife tolerance, wildlife poaching and trafficking, impacts of human-owned cats or dogs on wildlife, and vegetation change in and around protected areas. And in this map, this is the Southern African region. And in purple, I've highlighted the 3 countries where my dissertation research takes place. And today I'm going to share my recent research on wildlife tolerance in Mozambique and Zambia. For my dissertation research, my broadest question that I was concerned with was what lessons from coupled human and wildlife systems can help promote human-wildlife coexistence. My first paper is titled Wildlife Tolerance in Protected Area Borderlands. My second is Complexities of Human-Wildlife Coexistence. And the third is Impacts of Free-Roaming Dogs on Wildlife. But for the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about papers 1 and 2 today. My first paper, Tolerance of Wildlife in Protected Area Borderlands. This is co-authored with Dr. Painar, Dr. Fick, and Dr. Muyengwa. So when we talk about tolerance, tolerance is a word we often use in English, and we can use it to refer to different things. So in the context of wildlife, I'm using Kansky, Kidd, and Knight's definition, which is the ability and willingness of an individual to absorb the extra potential or actual costs of living with wildlife. And tolerance can vary based on attitudes, values, norms, as well as past experiences. Unfortunately, many conservation programs have assumed that tolerance is directly and proportionally linked to the direct costs of living with wildlife. For example, if wildlife causes a cost to you, then your tolerance will decrease proportionally in response to that cost. But understanding what influences tolerance towards wildlife will allow conservationists to design more effective interventions aimed at coexistence of humans and wildlife in shared spaces. For this paper, my research questions were, what influences tolerance for local wildlife in protected area borderlands? And are there hot or cold spots with higher or lower than average tolerance levels? My study area is Sabi Game Park. Sabi Game Park is a small, privately owned protected area in Mozambique. It borders Kruger National Park in South Africa, and it's part of what's called the Great Limpopo Trans-Frontier Conservation Area. This is an international conservation zone that spans South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. For the methods, I used 237 household livelihood surveys that were conducted by a conservation organization, Peace Parks Foundation. And with that data, I ran logistic regression analysis, as well as a GI star hotspot spatial analysis. For the logistic regression, to get a sense of tolerance, we use the question, do you like having wildlife in your area? And for the independent variables, we selected 15 independent variables. These were all based on current literature that suggests links between tolerance and attitudes, as well as all of these different variables: gender, age, education, employment, cattle and goat ownership, crop loss in the last year, predation in the last year, human injury caused by wildlife in the last year, restricted access to natural resources, agreement with rules governing wildlife, if any participants had received benefits from wildlife, as well as the monetary value of benefits, and finally, the distance from interviewees' household to the park fence and to the park entrance. We also included second level factors or relationships between these variables to see if there were any relevant interactions. And finally, I dredged all of these variables to find a combination of independent variables that had the lowest AIC or AKK information criteria value as the best fit model. So we were ultimately looking for the best predictive model. So some of the results, we found that 61% of respondents expressed tolerance for wildlife, which is over half, and that's a little encouraging. This graph shows the breakdown for each independent variable with tolerance in blue, intolerance in red, and the solid bars represent participants that answered yes to the indicator, and the hatched are those that answered no. So for example, our first variable is agreement with rules governing wildlife, and the agreement, those who agreed with rules governing wildlife were higher among those that tolerated wildlife than the proportion who agreed within those who did not tolerate wildlife. For the GI star hotspot analysis, we did not find any statistically significant hot or cold spots. And this map shows the location of tolerant households in blue dots and intolerant households in red X's. So they were pretty evenly distributed between tolerant and intolerant. Here are the results from the logistic regression. Our best fit model included 8 variables that were all significant at p is less than 0.1. We found that male respondents were 2 times more likely to tolerate wildlife than women. And as respondents got older, they were more likely to tolerate wildlife. Those who agreed with the rules governing wildlife were 30 times more likely to tolerate wildlife than those who did not agree. But this one also had an interaction term. So as participants got older, the impact of agreement with rules began to decrease, although it was still positively correlated for both age and agreement. Those respondents who received wildlife benefits were 4 times more likely to tolerate wildlife, but the amount of benefits received was actually a negative correlation with wildlife tolerance. So as the amount increased, there was a slight decrease in terms of tolerance. Distance to fence, as the distance increased, respondents were more likely to be tolerant of wildlife. And surprisingly, those who had restricted access to natural resources were over 4 times more likely to tolerate wildlife than those who had not had their access to natural resources restricted. So what does that mean? A few things stand out. First, the agreement with rules governing wildlife seems to be the most important indicator or predictor of tolerance. In terms of restricted access, this one was surprising. I expected that if participants' access to natural resources had been restricted by the creation of the game park, that they would have some animosity towards the game park and therefore the wildlife. However, it seems that the restricted access is a good thing, because in this case, the game park has a game fence around it, a large electric fence that is fairly effective at keeping wildlife within the park. So by restricting access of humans to go into the park and collect natural resources, it also restricts access of wildlife from coming from the park into the local communities. It's not 100% effective because certain species are able to go over, under, through, or around the fence, but it seems fairly effective at reducing interactions between potentially dangerous wildlife. In terms of costs from wildlife, you might have noticed that none of my cost predictors, crop rating, predation, or human harm and injury, were on the final model, suggesting that they're not significant predictors of tolerance. And the benefits were significant. However, the amount actually had the opposite effect than what we anticipated. This suggests that increasing the amount of benefits may not be helpful. It may actually be harmful. And finally, we noticed the importance of gender roles. There was a difference between men and women in terms of tolerance, and this is likely related to how women interact with natural resources. In Mozambique, women are often the ones that are going out daily to fetch water. They regularly collect medicinal plants or grasses for their household, and they're typically the ones who are practicing agriculture to feed their families. By engaging in all of these activities, they are more likely to be going into natural areas and interacting with wildlife. So they have more chances of interacting with wildlife that could potentially be dangerous. There are a few limitations of the study that I should note. One is that we only looked at wildlife in general, whereas tolerance likely varies across species. It's probably different when we're talking about a lion versus, say, an antelope, like an impala. We had a lack of a wealth variable. Because I used a survey that was already available through a conservation organization, I didn't get to choose which questions were on, and it was a very robust survey, which was helpful for my research, but it would have been nice to include a wealth variable because there's potential for households that are wealthier to be able to absorb some costs from wildlife, whereas households that are living kind of on the margin may not be able to absorb even small costs from wildlife. Finally, I did not address intangible costs or benefits because they were not available on the survey. This research does bring up some important recommendations for conservation organizations. First, we should shift our focus from direct costs as the primary driver of tolerance. Many conservation interventions operate on the assumption that wildlife costs are directly and proportionally related to tolerance, but this is likely too simplistic. So we should decrease our emphasis on mitigating costs as a means of developing tolerance. And I will note one caveat, this is in terms of tolerance. By mitigating costs such as crop rating or livestock loss, that might be really important for other aspects like human livelihoods, food security, or nutrition. But in terms of wildlife tolerance, it's unlikely to have much of an impact. Secondly, we should strive for small amounts of benefits that are equitably distributed throughout the community instead of trying to increase the amount of benefits per person or per household. Thirdly, we should engage communities in decision-making to improve the agreement with rules governing wildlife. If people have a say in how wildlife is managed, they are more likely to agree with the rules because they helped create them. And this can help improve tolerance since this was the strongest predictor of tolerance in the model. This is encouraging for community-based natural resource management programs that are already ongoing within the area. It suggests that they are likely to be very impactful in terms of tolerance. And finally, we should promote gender equity. This is a really challenging issue, and I don't have a lot of solutions in terms of how this even can be done, but I will note the importance of this. And while it's important for a lot of different reasons, it does tie directly into wildlife tolerance. Moving on to paper 2, the complexities of human-wildlife coexistence. So in the first paper, I examined tolerance for wildlife as a whole, but here we're going to look at some differences between species. And the research questions are: 1, how are humans and wildlife currently coexisting? 2, what are the local attitudes toward wildlife and perceptions of wildlife, and how does this vary by species? And 3, what are the tolerance levels for local wildlife species? So this study area is in Zambia. We're looking at Mukungule Game Management Area, which borders North Luangwa National Park. Oh, skipped a slide, sorry. So North Luangwa National Park is important for several reasons. It has high biodiversity rates. It is also well known for being home of a small population of black rhino that have been reintroduced into the area. And rhino are very much targeted for poaching. So there's high security of the rhino in the park. There are also high human-wildlife conflict incidences in the game management areas surrounding the park. There are low communal wildlife benefits and low tourism development. I used a mixed methods approach to address my research questions for this paper, and that consisted of 69 semi-structured interviews. These included open and closed questions, free listing, pile sorting, and ranking. So those 3 are activities that I had people do. And for free listing, I had participants orally list off all the animals that fell under a certain category. And the categories I used were animals that they dislike, harmful animals, and beneficial animals. For pile sorting, I used the cards that are pictured here. These are small index cards that were laminated, and they have pictures of different local wildlife species. And these cards were used, participants were asked to place cards in one of 2 categories or piles. And the piles that I used were harmful and not harmful, as well as animals that they would tolerate or not tolerate in their area. And finally, I used the same cards to have participants rank harmful species in terms of how severe the harm from the species was, as well as how frequently those species cause harm. So there were a lot of comments on conflict with wildlife. The main topics that came up were crop raiding from elephants, hippos, and bush pigs. Attacks on humans were generally focused on snakes and elephants. and livestock predation from leopards, genets, which are a small spotted cat, and birds of prey. Nearly 60% of the participants had experienced crop raiding over the previous year, and the primary culprit was elephants. For livestock loss, over 30% of the participants had experienced some type of livestock loss from wildlife over the past year. So this is specifically focused on predation, not disease or other types of loss. And the primary culprit were birds of prey. Also, I should note here, we're talking about livestock. That's often associated with cattle, but in this region, people don't own cattle. It's primarily smaller livestock, often chicken, guinea fowl, or other bird species, with some goats and pigs, as well as rabbits. So the results of the free list summary, collectively, there were 41 different species mentioned on the like lists and 35 different species on the dislike lists. For harmful and beneficial, there were 21 different species listed on each of those. And for like and dislike, as well as harmful and beneficial, there were some overlap in terms of some participants would list one animal on one list and other participants might list the same animal on the other list. While they were doing their free list, I would engage in conversation to ask why they liked certain animals or disliked other animals. And the general reasons for liking or disliking animals are listed here. Animals were usually liked based on aesthetics, taste, community benefits, superstitions, spiritual aspects, or family namesake, which is a cultural component. Reasons for disliking wildlife related to aesthetics, superstitions, spiritual aspects, personal harm, potential harm, and fear. So this graph here shows salient scores. Salient scores are a combination of how many people listed the species on their free list, as well as how high on the list it was included. This graph only shows scores over 0.05, and the asterisk denotes species that were included on both the like and dislike list by different people, which suggests some level of disagreement over whether an animal is generally liked or disliked. Moving on to the harmful and beneficial lists, the reasons for classifying animals as beneficial or harmful were more straightforward. They were beneficial if there were potential or realized benefits from trophy hunting, or potential benefits from tourism, as well as meat. And for harmful, it all related to predation, crop raiding, or threat to human lives. Again, these are the salient scores, and these are scores over 0.05, with the asterisk denoting species that are included on both lists. For harmful and beneficial, individuals were allowed to place the same species on both lists. It was not mutually exclusive like the like and dislike list was. From the pile sorting, people had to place all of these species into one category, whether it was harmful or not harmful. And you can see there was consensus. 100% of participants agreed that impala and zebra were not harmful in any way, whereas elephants were harmful, as well as hippos and snakes. They did the same activity in terms of tolerance. We found less consensus, but most people were willing to tolerate a lot of the antelope species like duiker, impala, zebras were also tolerated. And then snakes and crocodiles were least tolerated. So you might have noticed that elephants were the highest salient score on all 4 of the free lists. They were very highly liked, very highly disliked. They were considered very harmful as well as very beneficial. And 100% of participants classified elephants as harmful in the pile sorting activity. They were also ranked very high in terms of both severity and frequency of crop raiding. Despite all of this, 32% of people were willing to tolerate elephants, which is more than the percentage of people that were willing to tolerate crocodiles or snakes. So I found the elephant one of the more interesting species, so I highlighted that today. And here are some quotes that people gave about elephants. Elephants are a very big problem because they even kill people. Maybe elephants only come 2 or 3 times in a year, but they cause a lot of damage when they do. Although elephants bring problems, they also bring benefits to the community. A neighbor was killed last month while defending his field from an elephant. And elephants come to the fields from the time you plant until the time you harvest. So there are a few lessons that come out of this. One, it seems that tolerance levels are highly complex. They seem to be related to attitudes, costs, and benefits, but the relationship is nonlinear, and it seems to vary for different species. The relative importance of each one of these in determining tolerance can vary by species. Fear and cultural values seem to be very important, but these are often left out when we're thinking about how to improve tolerance. The potential value of trophy species was very well understood. People knew about how much one of these trophy species could be worth. And this mixed method approach can help illuminate some of the nuances of wildlife tolerance and guide efforts to promote coexistence. Of course, there are limitations of this study. It's a small pilot study that only incorporated 1 GMA, so it would need to be expanded to a larger region. It also could be expanded to a larger sample size. That's one of the challenges of this methodology. It's very time consuming, and so you can't get the same large sample sizes that you might be able to do with a simpler survey. But it does provide much more nuanced details. So it's a bit of a trade-off there. But even this methodology could be expanded to include different GMAs and a slightly larger sample size. It does not address drivers of tolerance. So this could be incorporated through focus groups in the methodology to discuss drivers of tolerance and try to ask people why. I would recommend adding focus groups before starting with the mixed methods interviews by incorporating, so those focus groups could incorporate some discussion of how that should be handled and give you ideas of what to include in those interviews. But you can also do focus groups at the end where you look at some of the preliminary results and ask people in the community why they think this is happening. And so it can be more of an iterative cycle. Finally, our study does not address spatial variation. This could be explored if a larger region were used and if the sample size were increased. In terms of conservation recommendations, again, we cannot assume that tolerance is based on a simple cost and benefit analysis or that solving surface level conflict will increase tolerance. Because of the example with elephants, they currently have high costs, low benefits, and frequent conflict, but they are well liked and some people are actually willing to tolerate them more than other species. So I recommend using a similar approach to assess the local context before implementing interventions. I think we need to broaden our focus beyond costs and benefits to include cultural and spiritual aspects. And finally, while some communities currently receive all of these communities currently receive few wildlife benefits, they clearly articulated the potential value of species for trophy hunting and tourism. And to me, this suggests that the current conservation education initiatives are doing a good job. And this shows that education campaigns focused on the potential value of wildlife are likely to be effective. So even if people are not necessarily receiving those benefits yet, if they realize that there's potential benefits, they might be willing to tolerate wildlife even in the short term before those benefits come. Of course, eventually those benefits will need to come for that tolerance to continue. So as a quick recap, my dissertation research focused on wildlife tolerance in protected areas, borderlands in Mozambique and complexities of human-wildlife coexistence in Zambia. And then reminder, paper 3 is on impacts of free roaming dogs on wildlife. I don't have time to go into the details of that paper, but I will give you a few spoilers for paper 3. Madagascar is home to many endemic and endangered species, and one threat to the wildlife comes from free roaming dogs. These are dogs that are owned by individuals, but they're allowed to wander freely throughout the village and surrounding area. This can lead to dogs killing native wildlife. And the risk factors are if there are more dogs, if the dogs are not fed by their owners, if dogs spend more time away from their home, either in the surrounding village or in protected areas, and if the dogs are owned for hunting. While the risks to wildlife may seem obvious, knowing what these risks are and ensuring that we are not assuming something that is incorrect, like we might have been in some of my other papers, can help us guide conservation programs that are targeted at reducing the risk of free roaming dogs on native wildlife. We also found great variation in the wildlife that was killed by dogs across the different villages, with some hot spots and cold spots of higher or lower than average amount of wildlife killed by free roaming dogs. And this might suggest that there is something going on in these different villages related to culture, taboos, or other aspects that we might not be aware of, but it highlights which villages we can follow up on and see what's going on there and how their insights might help guide conservation programs throughout the region and the country. So my overall conclusions for my dissertation are very broad. First, we need to reevaluate our conservation strategies for promoting coexistence and ensure that they're based on fact and not assumptions. Minimizing wildlife costs is unlikely to impact tolerance, although again, it might have important implications for other aspects like food security or nutrition. Understanding human attitudes, perceptions, behavior, and motivation is important for guiding conservation. And it's also vital that we assess the local context to tailor our conservation projects accordingly. So thank you everyone for listening to me today. I would also like to quickly acknowledge some of the many people who have helped me on my journey with my dissertation, as well as conducting this specific research. First and foremost, my amazing committee members, Drs. Child, Southworth, Fick, Hull, and Prainar. And then in Zambia, I was assisted by the Frankfurt Zoological Society, Rogers Lubilo, Chief Mukungule, Baheriko, and all of the participants in my study. In Mozambique, I would like to thank all of the field assistants and participants, as well as Peace Park Foundation and Shailak Muyengwa, who conducted the research, and Savi Game Park, who helped facilitate that process. And for funding, the UF Library Open Access Fund, CAS, and TCD. And again, thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We should have some time for questions and answers if anyone has questions.
Thank you very much, Leandra. Excellent. We open the floor for questions now. Anybody out there?
I had a question for you, Leandra. During your second paper, you were talking about tolerance to wildlife and mentioned that some of the reasons include cultural, spiritual, and superstitious beliefs and how they have influence. I'm wondering how open the participants were that you interviewed to openly discussing these types of things with someone not from the community.
That's a great question. And this is something that one should be concerned with, particularly when conducting more qualitative research, is how you as a researcher are impacting the responses that you get from participants. So this is something that I did put quite a bit of thought into before I started my research, and I was concerned about it. So I tried to minimize it in a few ways. One, I used a local translator who was from the community, who knew the people very well. And that was kind of my in. So I wasn't just showing up at random people's houses like, hey, I want to interview you. I had someone to kind of introduce me, and he was respected. And so that kind of gave me a level of respect as his accomplice, basically. But also I benefited greatly by doing research in central Zambia because I used to live there and I speak some of the local language. I'm also somewhat familiar with some of their spiritual and cultural aspects. So this helped me kind of test out a little bit. When I was talking to people and something came up that I was aware of was related to a spiritual or cultural topic, then I would kind of ask them about that and see if they would open up and give me the answer, even though I already knew it. And by using some of those as a test, it was able to help me see that people were actually pretty willing to talk about this. And I could go into all kinds of details because I'm really passionate about the methodology, and I think it's important that you're careful about all of this when you do it to make sure you do it right. But I also ensured that all of my interviews were private, so we were away from other people, so people felt more comfortable and kind of ease into that topic so that they had more chances to feel comfortable with me before I started asking them some of this sensitive information more about cultures and spiritual aspects. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, Leandra. Great job. This was a really interesting talk. I just had a question about one of your charts. It looked like chameleons were on the list of non-tolerated wildlife. I was just wondering why that is. Is it just because they're a lizard, or is there something going on with chameleons?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. There is definitely something going on with chameleons. And this is something that I included chameleons intentionally as one of the cards because I was aware that there was a kind of local taboo against chameleons. So there's these beliefs, and I tried to ask people to explain this to me because I know about it a little bit, but I wasn't entirely sure. And so some people thought that because chameleons are this magical creature, that basically if it bites you, it's going to inject poison and you're going to die, which ecologically is not true. Chameleons are essentially harmless, but most people recognize that chameleons were not physically harmful, but that they were like bad juju is basically the way that they phrase it. So it was like a superstition or bad omen. Like here in the States, you might think of black cats as having a similar response. So chameleons, a lot of people realize that like, well, they're harmless technically, but like spiritually or superstitiously, they are very potentially harmful.
Thank you. That's interesting.
I have a question pertaining to that. Were there any type of rituals or, use of hoodoo magic? You're talking about juju here in terms of talismans or other things that people use to perhaps ward off or keep away species that they felt were, that they didn't have a tolerance for. Any of that going on there?
So there was nothing specific that came up in any of my interviews. I am aware that people use animal-related talismans for spiritual reasons, and they often go to local traditional healers for some of these talismans or spells that can be related to protection or, getting money, succeeding in life, lots of different things. I didn't hear of anyone saying specifically to ward off like dangerous wildlife. So when asking about how to mitigate some of this human wildlife conflict, people focused more on physical things rather than spiritual things. So they talked about like ways to make noise to chase away elephants, how you can try to store your grain in these certain constructions to help prevent animals from getting into it. There were more practical reasons, and I didn't hear anyone use some spiritual aspect to help protect from other wildlife.
Interesting. Any other questions? I did have another question, actually. Paper one, you said that the wealth variable would have been something you'd have loved to have, right? In retrospect, looking back, are there any other variables perhaps now that you had a lot of time between you and finishing the research that you might have on the list as well besides the wealth variable? And In terms of wealth, how would you actually measure that? That's the second part of the question.
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
I did think about trying to create some type of wealth index from the information that I had available. And I also have had plenty of time during my PhD to think about how I would conduct, if I conducted this survey myself, exactly what I would ask and what variables I would look at. And I would like to do that someday, either back in Mozambique or somewhere else in Southern Africa. But I think wealth is a tricky one in these communities because people don't have a set income. They're not formally employed. So you'd have to get around it with some type of indicator that included the type of household that they lived in. If they did have any kind of, if they were a shopkeeper, they're probably a little more well off in terms of like hard money, actual money. So their livelihoods, their housing structure, if they have any other assets like a shop or a vehicle or a bicycle. So I was looking at some creative method of using that to create an index of wealth. And then in terms of other variables, there are quite a few that I would like to include. Most of them get at the less tangible costs or benefits. So thinking about like opportunity costs of having to protect your field from wildlife if you're up all night, or if you have to keep your kids out of school to herd the goats so that they don't get eaten by a lion, and now your kids are not getting educated. And those are things that are a lot harder to measure, but I think that's something that would fit in better in the methodology I used for the second paper, where we had more discussions and focus groups and kind of qualitative research to get at some of the intangible costs and benefits.
Very good, very good. Looks like you put a lot of thought into this. This is fantastic. Any other questions out there from our audience? Well, I guess we'll call it here. Excellent job, Leandra. Very professional, nice PowerPoint. To the point. There's Brian. Hi, Brian. You have a question, Brian? He's muted. You're muted. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, you did a great job.
Presentation.
She did a very nice job on this. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Anybody else with a quick question before we sign off? Okay, well, anyways, there's no takers. I'd like to thank everybody for a great semester. It was a pleasure being your host. This is the last talk of the 2021 semester in spring. John Moss will be taking over as colloquium organizer in the fall. I had a blast. I love you guys. And Leandra, great job.